The final note hung in the air like a question that would never be answered. A single guitar chord, sustained longer than it should have been, vibrating through the Terminal 1 venue in Munich, Germany. March 1st, 1994. Kurt Cobain's fingers stayed, pressed against the frets even after the sound had faded into silence. His eyes were closed, his body completely still. 35 days before he would be found dead in his Seattle home. Nobody in the crowd understood what they were witnessing. The show had been chaos from the beginning. Not the controlled chaos that Nirvana was known for. Real chaos, the kind that comes from things falling apart in ways nobody can stop. This was supposed to be one of the final European dates of Nirvana's tour. One more performance before they could go home, before Kurt could see his daughter Frances Bean, before they could take a break from the relentless machine of touring that had been grinding them down for months. But by the time they reached Munich, everyone close to the band knew something was very wrong. Kurt had been sick for weeks. His voice was destroyed. His body was shutting down from the combination of his chronic stomach condition, exhaustion, and the substances he'd been using to cope with both. He'd been hospitalized in Rome just days earlier after what was officially called an accidental overdose, and what many suspected was a suicide attempt. Courtney Love had flown in. There had been fights, reconciliations, more fights. The kind of desperate, circular arguments that happen when two people love each other but are also destroying each other and don't know how to stop either process. The decision to continue the tour after Rome was controversial. Management wanted to cancel. The band's doctor said Kurt needed extended rest. Dave Grohl and Chris Novoselic were worried in ways they couldn't fully articulate. But Kurt insisted. He said he could do it, said he needed to do it, said stopping would be worse than continuing because stopping meant admitting defeat, and he wasn't ready to admit defeat, so they continued. One more show, then another, then Munich. The Terminal 1 was packed with fans who had no idea how close to the edge their idol was standing. They'd come to see Nirvana, to hear Smells Like Teen Spirit and Come As You Are, and all the songs that had defined their teenage years. They'd come for entertainment, for the experience of being in the same room as Kurt Cobain, for the story they could tell later about the night they saw Nirvana live. They weren't prepared for what they actually got. A farewell disguised as a performance, a goodbye hidden in plain sight. Kurt walked onto the stage looking like a ghost. The weight he'd lost over the past months was visible even from the back rows. His clothes hung loose on his frame. His skin was pale in a way that suggested illness rather than just avoiding the sun. But it was his eyes that told the real story, empty in a way that went beyond tiredness, beyond depression, a specific kind of emptiness that comes from already being partially gone, from having one foot in this world and one foot somewhere else, from having made decisions that couldn't be unmade. The setlist that night was strange, songs in an order that didn't make sense, deep cuts mixed with hits in ways that suggested Kurt wasn't thinking about what the audience wanted, wasn't thinking about the typical arc of a Nirvana show. He was playing what he wanted to play, what he needed to play, songs that meant something to him, personally, rather than songs that would satisfy the crowd. It was a set list chosen by someone who knew this might be his last chance to play these particular songs and wanted to make sure he got to all of them. During Heart-Shaped Box, Kurt's voice cracked on the high notes, not the usual crack of a rock singer pushing their limits. The crack of something fundamentally broken. He powered through, but everyone could hear it. The damage, the deterioration. Some fans close to the stage exchanged worried glances. Others just assumed it was part of the grunge aesthetic. The raw, unpolished sound that had made Nirvana famous. They didn't understand they were hearing a man's voice literally falling apart, hearing the physical manifestation of everything that was wrong. Between songs, Kurt barely spoke to the audience. Usually, even when he was uncomfortable with the spotlight, he'd make some minimal effort at banter, a joke, a comment, something to acknowledge the people who'd paid money to see him. But tonight, nothing. He just played, moved mechanically from one song to the next. His guitar work was technically proficient, but emotionally distant, like he was going through motions he'd performed so many times. They'd become automatic, like the part of him that connected emotionally to the music had already left and only the muscle memory remained. Dave Grohl, behind his drum kit, watched Kurt constantly. He'd known Kurt for years, had been through the underground scene together, had experienced the impossible, transition from unknown band to cultural phenomenon together. He could read Kurt's moods, could tell when Kurt was having a bad day versus a catastrophic day. And tonight, every signal Dave's instincts were giving him said catastrophic. Something about Kurt's posture, the way he held his guitar, the way he moved between songs, all of it said this wasn't just another difficult show. This was something else entirely. Krist Novoselic felt it too, the wrongness permeating everything. He and Kurt had been friends since high school, had started Nirvana together when they were just kids with instruments and dreams, had built something neither of them fully understood or knew how to handle. Krist had watched Kurt struggle with fame, with expectation, with the gap between who Kurt actually was and who the world needed him to be. But tonight was different. Tonight felt final, in a way Christ couldn't name, but couldn't ignore. The crowd remained largely oblivious. They cheered after each song, screamed for encores, held up signs, did all the things audiences do at rock shows. A few people close to the front were concerned, could see that something was off, but most people were just there for the experience, for the music, for the chance to be part of something they didn't understand. They were witnessing an ending, a closure, a farewell delivered in a language they didn't speak. As the show progressed, Kurt's playing became more intense, not louder or more aggressive, just more present, like he was putting something into each note that hadn't been there before, a weight, a significance. He was playing like every chord mattered, like every song might be the last song, which, of course, some of them would be. But he was the only person in Terminal 1 who knew that, the only person who understood what was really happening on that stage. During All Apologies, something shifted. The song Kurt had written as something between a suicide note and a prayer. The song that was both apology and accusation. Sorry for existing wrong. Sorry for disappointing everyone. Sorry for not being who they needed him to be. As he sang the words, his voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. The crowd went silent, straining to hear, and in that silence, attentive listeners could hear something breaking. Not just in Kurt's voice, in the way he was delivering the lyrics. Like he meant them more tonight than he'd ever meant them before. The final verse approached. All in all is all we are. The most Kurt Cobain line ever written. Resignation and acceptance and nihilism and beauty all wrapped together. A statement that this existence, flawed and painful and brief, is all there is. No transcendence waiting, no meaning beyond what we make. Just being and then not being. Kurt sang those words with his eyes closed, and something about the way he sang them, the finality in his voice, made a handful of people in the audience suddenly uncomfortable without understanding why. Then came the moment that would haunt everyone who was there once they understood its significance. The show was supposed to end with endless, nameless, the chaotic, noise rock freakout that Nirvana often used as a closer. But Kurt changed the plan, waved off Dave and Krist when they started the intro. Instead, he stayed at the microphone, alone, and began playing. Where Did You Sleep Last Night, the lead belly cover that would become famous from MTV Unplugged. But this was before Unplugged, before most people knew Nirvana even played this song. The choice was bizarre. It wasn't a Nirvana song in the traditional sense. It was a folk blues number from the 1940s about death and loss and mystery, about someone disappearing into the pines where the sun never shines, about cold and darkness and the final sleep. Why would Kurt choose this for the last song of a rock show in Munich? Why would he play it alone, without the band? The audience was confused, but captivated. Something about the moment demanded attention. Kurt's voice, destroyed as it was, found something extra for this song. Some reserve of power he'd been saving, or maybe not saving, maybe accessing because this was the last time he'd need to access it. He sang about the pines and the cold and the shivering, and the black girl who caused the narrator to weep. He sang like he was inhabiting the song, like he understood on a cellular level what it meant to disappear into somewhere the sun doesn't shine, like he'd already made the decision to go there himself. The final verse built. Kurt's voice rose, strained, pushed, beyond what his damaged vocal cords could reasonably sustain. The pain in his voice was audible, physical, like every word was cutting him on the way out. But he kept singing, kept pushing, building towards something the audience couldn't see coming, but could feel approaching. The tension in Terminal 1 became almost unbearable. Everyone was leaning forward, holding their breath, waiting for whatever was about to happen. And then Kurt hit the final line, "Where the sun don't ever shine." He sang it with everything he had left, voice breaking, body shaking, pouring every ounce of pain and exhaustion and resignation into those words. The note sustained, rose, became almost a scream, and then broke completely. His voice gave out mid-note, shattered, leaving only silence. But Kurt didn't stop. His guitar was still in his hands, and he played one final chord, the chord that would be the last chord Kurt Cobain ever played in front of a paying audience. He let it ring out, long past when a normal performer would have stopped, long past when it was musically necessary. He held that chord and let it fill Terminal 1 with sound. Let it wash over 3,000 people who didn't understand what they were hearing. A goodbye, a farewell, a final statement from someone who knew he was making a final statement but couldn't say it directly. His fingers stayed on the frets. The chord sustained. Feedback began to build, that characteristic Nirvana sound of guitars pushed past their limits. But this time it wasn't aggressive. It was mournful, haunting. The sound hung in the air, filled every corner of the venue. And then finally, Kurt lifted his fingers. The sound died. Silence filled the space where music had been. And Kurt Cobain stood at the center of the stage, with his head bowed and his eyes closed, completely still. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The audience was frozen, unsure if the show was over, unsure what had just happened, unsure why this felt different from every other concert ending they'd experienced. Dave and Chris stood at their instruments, equally motionless. They'd felt something too, something final, something that made them afraid to move or speak, or break whatever spell had been cast. Then Kurt opened his eyes, looked out at the crowd, and for just a moment, the mask dropped completely. Anyone paying close attention could see it, the goodbye in his eyes, the finality in his expression, the look of someone who had already left, even though his body was still standing there. He wasn't looking at the audience as fans or consumers, or people who expected things from him. He was looking at them as witnesses, as the last people who would see him perform, as the final audience for the final show of Kurt Cobain's life. He took the guitar off, set it down on the stage, not thrown, not smashed, placed gently, deliberately, with a care that suggested ritual rather than routine. Then he walked off stage without a word. No goodbye, no acknowledgement, no wave, just exit. Dave and Chris exchanged confused glances, then followed, and the show was over. Just like that. No encore, no final bow. Just Kurt Cobain walking off stage for the last time while 3,000 people stood in confused silence. Backstage, Kurt collapsed onto a couch and didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the venue staff, didn't participate in the usual post-show routine. He just sat, stared at nothing. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was existential. The exhaustion of someone who had given absolutely everything and had nothing left to give, who had performed his goodbye and now needed everyone to just leave him, alone with what he'd done. Management tried to talk to him about the show, about how it had gone, about logistics for the remaining tour dates. But Kurt wasn't responsive. Eventually they gave up and let him be. He sat on that couch for hours, long after the venue had emptied, long after Dave and Christ had left, long after there was any reason to still be there, just sitting, thinking, processing, saying whatever private goodbyes needed to be, said to this part of his life that was ending. The next morning, Nirvana's management announced the cancellation of the remaining tour dates. Kurt was too sick to continue. He needed medical attention. He needed rest. The official story was bronchitis and exhaustion. The unofficial story was darker. The people closest to Kurt were seriously worried. More worried than they'd been even during his worst periods. Something about Munich had scared them, had made them understand that this wasn't just another rough patch. This was crisis. This was emergency. This was the sound of a countdown clock that was running out of time. Kurt returned to the United States. There were attempts at intervention, discussions about rehab, plans that might have worked if there had been more time. But there wasn't more time. On March the 1st in Munich, Kurt Cobain had played his final note. And 35 days later, on April 5th, 1994, he was dead. Suicide in his Seattle home. Gone at 27, the voice of a generation silenced. The final note of his life played, in the same lonely key as the final note of that Munich show. Looking back, everything about that final performance was a goodbye that nobody recognized. The set list of personally meaningful songs rather than crowd pleasers. The emotional intensity that went beyond normal performance. The choice to end with, "Where did you sleep last night?" A song about disappearing into darkness. The way he held that final chord longer than necessary. The care with which he set down his guitar. The look in his eyes as he stared at the audience one last time. All of it was Kurt saying farewell. All of it was him trying to communicate what he couldn't say directly. But how could the audience have known? How could anyone have understood, in real time, that they were watching? Someone's final bow. We don't expect our entertainers to be literally dying in front of us. We assume the performance is separate from the person. That the pain is artistic rather than actual. That the goodbye is metaphorical rather than literal. We assume we'll have more chances, more shows, more opportunities to appreciate what we're witnessing. We don't consider that this might be the last time, that the final note might actually be final. The bootleg recordings of that Munich show circulated after Kurt's death. Fans who'd been there that night listened back with new understanding, heard the goodbye they'd missed in the moment, heard the finality in Kurt's voice during all apologies, heard the significance of that last sustained chord. Heard everything they couldn't hear when they thought this was just another show. And the guilt hit hard, the knowledge that they'd been present for Kurt Cobain's farewell and hadn't recognized it, hadn't appreciated it, hadn't understood what was being offered. But that guilt, painful as it is, misses something important. Kurt didn't want his goodbye to be recognized. He didn't want intervention or saving or people trying to talk him out of whatever decision he'd already made. He just wanted to play one more time, to give music one final offering, to end his performing life on his own terms with a song about disappearing into darkness and a final chord that hung in the air like a question mark. The disguise was intentional. The hidden nature of the farewell was the point. Years later, survivors who'd been at Terminal 1 that night would talk about the show in quiet, haunted tones. They'd describe the feeling in the room, even if they couldn't name what the feeling was, the weight in the air, the sense that something significant was happening, even if they couldn't understand what. They'd talk about that final chord, how it felt different, how it seemed to last forever, how the silence that followed was unlike any silence they'd experienced at a concert before or since. They'd been witnesses to an ending, participants in a ritual they didn't know they were participating in, the last audience for the last performance of Kurt Cobain's life. That's what happened on March 1st, 1994, at Terminal 1 in Munich. That's what Kurt Cobain did when he played his final note. He said goodbye in the only language he'd ever really been fluent in, through music, through that sustained chord, through the care with which he set down his guitar, through the look in his eyes as he walked off stage. He gave everyone present a gift they didn't know they were receiving, the chance to be there at the end, to witness the final moment, to hear the last note, even if they didn't understand what they were hearing, until it was too late to say goodbye back.